Crisis Radio. The South Korean government talking about the Tobin tax. Naturally, if you go to my website, tarpley.net, you'll see my interview in a leading South Korean English language magazine some months back, calling on the South Korean government and the other G20 powers to institute a Tobin tax. You heard that first here. A couple of other brief notes. Christie, right? We've been hitting him. Michelle Rhee, the union buster here from Washington, D.C., now that Mayor Fenty has been defeated here in the District of Columbia, his union-busting, wage-gouging, school-destroying school chancellor Michelle Rhee, a real villain, operating under all kinds of left cover, reform cover. She's now gravitating apparently to Christie in New Jersey. She's been on a binge of mass firings and closing schools in the district, and now this torpedo Rhee will be moved on to join Christie. Right, birds of a feather flock together, and this shows what Rhee was about the whole time: a reactionary, union-busting exercise. But now let's talk about the Greyhound. The Greyhound, of course, refers to a prophecy contained in the beginning of the Divine Comedy in the first canto when Dante meets Virgil, and Virgil says the only way out of your situation is you're going to have to descend through the inferno, climb purgatory, and then see what's going on in paradise. That all begins 700 years ago now. Again, if you know the Divine Comedy, one of the main themes all the way through it and in Dante's life at this point is you have the Holy Roman Empire, which is left over from Charlemagne. It's essentially Germany and some of the Low Countries, some parts that are today France, but northern Italy down to about, Bologna, Florence are all in it, down to the northern parts of the Papal States in those days, almost to Rome. This is all one political unit, and it's called the Holy Roman Empire. And spare me the quips about not holy, not Roman, and not an empire. This was a fairly long-lasting political entity, became extinct around the time of Napoleon, but had been there for, on the whole, about 1,000 years. Weak, decentralized, chaotic, what have you. The question was that Dante wanted to reassert the power of the Holy Roman Empire in northern Italy for various reasons. These are not so important for us now. 700 years ago, this week, we have the very small military force, a tiny army of 4,000 or 5,000 troops crossing the Alps and getting to Susa in northern Italy on October 23rd, that is to say, the Saturday when this program goes on the air. And during the course, then, of the following months, Henry VII of Luxembourg, the newly elected Holy Roman Emperor, goes around to different places. He goes to Turin, where the Olympics were. He goes to Asti, where the Asti Spumante comes from. And then on the 23rd of December, he entered Milan, very important city, largest city in northern Italy, and in many ways the key to the entire central and northern parts of the country. And he then is crowned with the Iron Crown of Lombardy, something that's left over from the Lombard or Langobard kingdom of Lombardy, which had been around in the 700s and the 800s. But the most important thing he does for our purposes is at the time that Henry VII arrives, the boss of Milan is a signore, right? This is a signoria. It's a dictatorship, you might say. It's a city-state with a dictatorship, and this is the dictatorship of Guido della Torre. So this guy is a Guelph. He's pro-papacy. Papacy means, in this case, Boniface VIII, a bad guy. And instead, Dante is part of the Ghibelline party, the pro-imperial party by this time. Had not been, but then became one after he had been exiled from Florence. The big thing is that thanks to the presence of Henry VII, Matteo Visconti is put into power in Milan. Now, we will not follow Henry VII and what happens to him, his siege of Florence, and eventually how he's murdered and poisoned. We'll get to those things in future broadcasts, because we've now got a season, a whole period now of a couple of years, where we'll be living through the 700th anniversaries of a whole series of events in the life of Dante and politics of the world, because this stuff is world historical. This is not some local northern Italian, Lombard, Milanese event. This is the big stuff, because we're talking the origins of the modern state. Where does the modern state come from? Well, Henry VII installs Matteo Visconti as the boss, the dictator, the leader, the signore of Milan. And that's the nucleus from which the prototype of the modern state appears. Notice I say prototype. It's not yet the modern state. For the modern state, we're going to have to wait until 1460, 1470, 1480. We're going to have to wait for people like Louis XI of France. We're going to have to wait for Henry VII, Earl of Richmond, Henry Tudor in England. But those guys worked off a model. And the model they worked off was Milan. It was the Italian dukedoms by that time, larger than city-states, and in particular, they looked at Milan because this was the one that had been most successful in terms of expansion and came close at various times. Around 1400, Gian Galeazzo Visconti almost united most of northern Italy, including Florence and including perhaps even Venice, which would have been a tremendous thing, under one political unit. So that is the prototype of the modern state. And notice, it's born with an economic program. The middle class, the modern state go together. And the specific form with Gian Galeazzo Visconti was, in order to get the support of peasants and farmers, he gave them debt relief. He gave them what Obama will not do. He'd say, I'll write down the principal on your mortgage, in effect. I'll give you a mortgage freeze. I'll give you a foreclosure freeze if you support me against whatever local boss in some other city he was competing with. So this is all growing out of the arrival of Henry VII in northern Italy. This is Henry VII of Luxembourg now in 1310. And the growth of it is by the end of 1313, the Visconti, put into power by Henry of Luxembourg, kicking out the Della Torre group, they controlled Piacenza, Lodi, Bobbio, and Novara. These are towns in the area. Then Como, Bergamo, Tortona, Pavia, Cremona, where the violins come from, and so on. So you get the idea. Parma, where the cheese comes from, Vercelli, and so forth. A large piece of northern Italy, and by 1370, 1380, 1390, Gian Galeazzo Visconti assembles what looks like it's going to become a northern Italian kingdom, and unfortunately he is then cut down by, again they say smallpox, and again quite possibly poisoned in the same way that Henry of Luxembourg was poisoned. This is the beginning of the modern state. It's also the beginning of the idea of the Divine Comedy, that up until about 1308, 1309, 1310, Dante is not thinking about writing this huge epic poem, probably the greatest single work of world literature, certainly the first example of a modern language in the sense that they're commonly found around the world today. He was not thinking about this, so the idea that Henry VII of Luxembourg, the Holy Roman Emperor, is coming to northern Italy to reassert imperial or Ghibelline power against these Guelphs who have been supporting Boniface VIII. This goes together. The idea of the Divine Comedy as a kind of a manual or handbook goes together with the political project of Henry VII of Luxembourg. And the outcome of this is not what Dante wanted. It's not what he predicted. It was not the reestablishment of the Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire in northern Italy. That did not work. But what it did do was to create the Scaliati, the Visconti, as well as the Scala family in Verona. We'll talk about them. Those two, with the Visconti eventually winning out, become the prototype of the modern state. So that's the great tradition. And look at the great people that have committed to the modern state and helped to build it. Don't throw this away for some cheap slogan brought to you by the Koch brothers or by this Jim Ricketts, who also seems to own a lot of these things. See you next week.